If there's one word I would use to describe Nintendo games, it would be polish. Their games always ship finished and without bugs. They look and sound great. Outside of console gimmicks, they control simply and effectively. Link's Awakening is no different. It is very much a classic Zelda experience, going so far with the idea of polish that its art style looks like finely polished claymation. And while it is a remake of a Game Boy game, the quality of which it was put together for the Switch kind of makes you forget that this was a Game Boy game to begin with. I'm going to break down my thoughts on this game into 3 parts. Part 1 will look at the basics, that is what the game is about, how does it feel to play, the aesthetics, and the performance. I'll finish this part with my review of its amount of content and whether or not it is worth the full price. This part will be light on spoilers. Part 2 will be a deep dive on the content, primarily focused on the world design and the dungeons. And Part 3 will be a look at the new mode added to this version of the game, the Chamber Dungeons, which is Zelda's Dungeon Builder. There's a podcast companion to this video, which is strictly the audio portion from the video, so if you like to listen to this stuff instead of watching it, then that is in the description below. Let's start with Part 1, the basics. The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening was originally released on Game Boy in 1993. It was the 4th game in the series, nudged right in between A Link to the Past and Ocarina of Time. It received a re-release in 1998 for the Game Boy Color, featuring color graphics and a touch more content. I would consider myself a casual Zelda fan. I've played a handful of Zelda games in my life. Of those, my favorites remain to be Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask. Conceptually and story-wise, Majora's Mask would be my favorite, but, well, Ocarina of Time is a lot more fun to play, isn't it? I haven't played the original Link's Awakening, so I cannot speak on the differences between this version and that. Alternatively, my attention was immediately drawn when seeing the reveal of this game at Nintendo's E3 Direct this year. It has a cutesy diorama look reminiscent of Animal Crossing, Captain Toad, or Spelunky. It reminded me a lot of Minish Cap, which is another Zelda game I enjoy. This type of art style is highly effective for me. Link's Awakening is bright, colorful, and shiny. There is a hazy effect that settles on the outside of the screen while you're exploring the overworld, which hammers home the setting of taking place within a dream. The sound effects are for the most part solid and satisfying. Those classic Zelda sounds of smashing pots and chopping blades of grass are all on point. Some of the voices I found quite strange, namely the granny, the mountain climber, and Link's damage sounds. I can't think of a Zelda game that has boring or uninspired music, and while Link's Awakening's music isn't top-notch, it is still of a high standard. I don't care much for the boss battle theme or the Animal Village music, but other than that, it all works and fits whatever part of the world you are on. As for the world, this has to be one of the smallest I've encountered in a Zelda game, but I don't see that as a con. The world is tightly packed and interconnected. Acquiring new items opens up shortcuts and new pathways in a simple yet satisfying way. It is interesting to walk by an area you may not actually get to dive into for another hour, or maybe even 7, but you can still see parts of it on your screen. I found that by the end of the game, I had such a strong concept of all the connecting pathways in the world, even with the presence of fast travel, that I felt I learned how it all worked, instead of constantly having to refer to the menu map. Structurally, much like other Zelda games, you explore through the world trying to find the next dungeon. On your way, picking up collectibles like heart pieces and seashells, you can stop in the towns and talk with the people living there, play mini-games, or a new feature, create some chamber dungeons. Sometimes it is over-explained to you where to go, but there are other times I was left a little confused wandering around until I happened upon what I was supposed to do next. There is a few telephone booths scattered throughout the world. On the other end of the line, a man from the village will give you a hint on where to go next, if it isn't obvious. The content ranges from decent to amazing, though some of it can be a bit repetitive. A criticism I'm surprised I have to make, especially with my opening of Nintendo's level of polish, is the game's performance. This game has frequent performance issues. For about half a second, anytime you enter a new screen through a loading zone, the frame rate tanks. The dungeons, thankfully, are mostly an exception to this, but they aren't fully immune either. I noticed this almost right away while playing, and ended up having to get used to it. And the truth is, it's not game-breaking. Rarely are you asked to do something technical right out of a load screen, but it was a minor annoyance for me that never went away. Most of my playtime was spent docked, and of the tests I did of handheld mode, the frame rate issue was mostly consistent, which was surprising. Usually there is a noticeable quality upgrade to docked mode. Performance-wise, other than that, I had no issues, no glitches, or anything of the sort. I played through the game mostly with a Pro Controller, and then a bit with Joy-Cons. Both methods felt intuitive and crisp. The only thing I would change is that early on in the game, you get the Rock's Feather item, which allows you to jump. You only get 2 equip slots from your inventory outside your sword and shield, and it only felt right for me to have the jump feature on at all times. Perhaps it would have been best to make the jump tied to another button and allow 2 other items to be equipped at all times. I know it isn't inherent to Zelda games to allow a free use jump, but when it is an option, it starts to feel essential, and my X button became the jump button. I appreciate the setting and theme of this world. The characters are charming. Overall, it is lighthearted and fun, but there is a reason I don't have a part of this breakdown dedicated to story. It is insubstantial enough that I don't have anything to say about it. My playthrough from opening cinematic to credits was about 14 hours long. That does include getting stuck a couple of times, messing around with some mini games, and doing some general exploration, but I don't imagine my time is much off of the average. If you critical pathed it didn't get stuck for too long, you could shave another couple hours off of that. To achieve 100% completion, that is obtaining all of the collectibles and completing all the chamber dungeons, this didn't add all that much playtime onto my total time with the game, and most of that was busy work and wasn't all that enjoyable, and harkens back to the repetitiveness I mentioned earlier. Of the base game hours to complete the game, I really enjoyed my time. It is another Zelda game I am happy to have within my repertoire, and it was enjoyable from start to finish with just a couple hiccups. But that isn't a lot of hours, and Nintendo games, like Link's Awakening, drop on the market at full price. The first time it goes on sale will be a year from now for 5% off, so whether or not it is worth it to pick this game up at full price is a hard ask. You will get a lot more bang for your buck with Breath of the Wild, or some other summer hits like Ultimate Alliance or Fire Emblem. For the price point they're asking for this game, I could recommend you 5 indie games that will give you just as much enjoyment for a much lower price point. Although if you are a big Zelda fan, well, you have probably played the original and know whether or not this is worth it for you, but it greatly satisfied that Zelda itch, which I'm prone to every few years. How much your money is worth is up to you, but I can confidently say that this game, being a remake, is overpriced for how much content you get out of it. Part 2, the content with a focus on the dungeons. I'm going to drop the spoiler warning now. If, based on what I said above, you are wanting to play this game yourself, pause this episode and come back once you have finished the game. I'm going to give a commentary-like walkthrough of the content bits of the game, that being the mini-games, trading sequence, dungeons, mini-dungeons, and events, and these things are best experienced yourself rather than having me explain away the interest or the surprises. The game starts as many Zelda games do, dropping you in a quaint and peaceful town known as Mabe Village. You are given a shield right off the bat and make your way down to the beach to grab your sword. From there, you go to the mysterious woods, which serves as this game's tutorial area. Here you will fight a few different core enemy types and learn the basics of block to stun and then sword follow-up combat. You also acquire your first equipable item here, the magic powder, which you can use to stun enemies or light torches. From the beginning in the town, you have access to a few NPCs you can talk to, the library with a variety of books with tips and tricks. You have the shop and 2 minigames. The claw game, which is exactly what it sounds like. I found the physics of this game to be very satisfying. Of the 3 minigames was my favorite. The second one available in the town is fishing. This has a bit of a learning curve to it, but is overall, ironically, a bit dry. I did this just enough to earn the collectibles and then went on my merry way. Using the key given from completing the mysterious woods, you can make your way to the first dungeon, the Tail Cave. The Tail Cave serves as a great introduction to this game's dungeon system. It has that classic top-down room-style action. You progress through the dungeon, fighting enemies and solving simple puzzles, collecting keys to unlock other chunks of the dungeon. At some point, you will get a new item which reconceptualizes the dungeon, giving new ways to traverse the areas you have experienced thus far. You will get a map and compass to help orient yourself and find the chests. Eventually, you will find the Nightmare Key, which lets you fight the boss. There is also a feature I haven't seen in other Zelda games, being the owl and his beak. You will find the beak in a chest somewhere in the dungeon, and you can pop it into an owl. Most dungeons have 2 or 3 of them, and they provide you with a small hint, similar to the telephone booths in the overworld. Other Zelda games have hint systems, but the owl's beak is an item you find somewhere in the dungeon, so you don't have it 100% of the time, unlike the fairy which you have in the N64 Zelda games. There is also a teleporter that opens up at some point, which allows unlimited travel from a certain room to the start of the dungeon. This first dungeon introduces the idea of non-linearity to the dungeons in this game. The first example isn't anything major, but once you get your first key, you can take it a couple of directions. You cannot choose incorrectly, but this style of dungeon helps reinforce that feeling of player choice, which is important. Since this is still early on in the game, this dungeon is fairly open. It doesn't feel too claustrophobic and lets you breathe while you are getting used to the controls while you make your way through. The item you get here is Rock's Feather, which gives Link the ability to jump. This ability is immediately tested with a mini-boss who tosses a spiked roller across the ground, requiring you to jump to get over it. The boss of this dungeon is pretty basic. It bounces along the walls with a weak point on the end of its tail. Now, after completing this dungeon, the player is awarded a full heart container and an instrument. All 8 of these instruments are required to battle the final boss. Here, you are given the full moon cello. This dungeon is simple, but for the first dungeon in the game, that is a good choice. There is a rewarding feeling that comes with completing these dungeons, not just from a story perspective, but also through the item unlock. Once you leave the dungeon, you have all these thoughts of places you think you could use that newly acquired item to traverse. For the most part, this is satisfying, although this first section after clearing the tail cave feels a bit odd, since it seems you have the chance to jump up the hill you came down to get here. Visually, you should be able to, but you cannot. Once you head back to town, it is revealed that some moblins raided town, and you have to go find one of the village's pets, Bow Wow, who is a chain chomp. Yes, that's right, a chain chomp. This is a fun difference from other Zelda games. Many Mario characters make appearances and cameos, such as Princess Peach, the Goombas, Bloopers, Thwomps, and more, as well as an enemy type that appears in one dungeon, which is Kirby. Anyway, you head back through the mysterious woods and fight through a mini dungeon to retrieve Bow Wow. He is cuffed to your leg and follows behind you, attacking enemies and hinting at places to dig for collectibles. This was a pleasant surprise and shakes up the Zelda exploration formula in an interesting way. Many Zelda games offer Epona or other horses as a companion, but this mashup of Zelda and Mario is unique to this Zelda experience. You end up spending a decent chunk of time with the Chain Chomp, and it helps navigate through the Gapanga Swamp towards the second dungeon, the Bottle Grotto. Bottle Grotto introduces some new enemy types like the spiky backs, boos, piranha plants, and the Shy Guys, as well as the Cyclops mini-boss. It introduces staircase shortcuts, which feature short 2D platforming sequences. The item earned here is the Power Bracelet, which lets you pick up heavy objects. In this dungeon, it lets you pick up and smash pots, which act as obstacles. And out in the overworld, you can now pick up boulders. The main puzzle element of this dungeon is through the orange and blue raising blocks, of which one color will always be up and the opposite down. You alternate these by attacking the crystals around the dungeon. This puzzle element is used often throughout the game, and the Bottle Grotto does a great job of introducing this mechanic in a relatively simple way. Many keys and doors are only opened/dropped once all the enemies in a room have been defeated, and there is a well-hidden objective here in one of those rooms in which you have to defeat the 3 enemies in the room in a set order, and not the order that you would naturally do it on your own. This is given to you in a hint through the owl statue, and is probably the only part of this dungeon that poses any challenge. Otherwise, it is still an early dungeon more about introducing mechanics than expanding on them. However, the boss here is one of my favorites, the clown/genie in the lamp. In the first phase, you must dodge his attacks until he recedes into his urn, which you strike and then pick up and throw into the wall to smash. After doing this a few times, he enters the second phase, where he circles Link before becoming vulnerable and going for a strike. Defeating the clown gives you the conch horn. Now that the player has both the ability to jump and move boulders, you can traverse much larger areas of the overworld. You will probably quickly make your way a bit north, where you can gaze upon the egg of the Windfish, which is the mystical creature you are gathering all of these instruments to serenade. Being told this will awaken the Windfish and take Link back home. It's only natural for the next section of the game to be spent exploring for a while, so I want to take this time to talk about the side quests in this game. I use the word side lightly because while it is not technically mandatory, it might as well be. Completing the side quest is nearly essential to reasonably access the final boss and beat the game. This side quest is known as the trading sequence. You will get the Yoshi doll from the claw machine, which you give to the mother in town, who gives you a ribbon. The ribbon you take to Bow Wow's owner and trade it for dog food. This dog food you take to Sale's banana stand, who gives you some bananas. The bananas, unsurprisingly, go to the monkey near the Candlelit Castle, who builds you a bridge and gives you the honeycomb. Sometimes once you are given one of these items, you will immediately know what to do with it. Sometimes you have no idea until you come across someone who asks you for it. This is a fun sequence that adds a little bit of layering to the formula of exploration into dungeon, into exploration, etc. Parts of the sequence are mandatory, such as giving the bananas to the monkeys, since the bridge they build is used to access the next mini-dungeon, Candlelit Castle. This is a fun, albeit short section. I tend to really enjoy the castle levels in Zelda games. The next dungeon might be my favorite in the whole game, Key Cavern. This dungeon is a total mess in the best way possible. As the title suggests, this place is loaded with keys. These keys are partnered with non-linear pathways. I spent a while trying to piece this one together in my head. Early on in the dungeon, you are dropped into a room with 4 keyed-off entrances in all directions. You cannot choose a wrong pathway here, but these options make for really satisfying player choice. The new item earned here are the Pegasus boots. This is an upgrade that is mapped to your left bumper and is always equipped. After a bit of charge time, the player darts off in whatever direction they are facing with the sword extended. You can use this to attack enemies or make it past the new obstacle, these strange things on the ground that kind of look like balloons. You can also combine this run with Rock's Feather and take an extended jump over an enlarged gap. This reconceptualizes the dungeon in a satisfying way, and immediately your mind starts racing of all the ways you can use this newfound power. Those pesky orange-blue blocks are used better here than the previous dungeon, and some new enemies are introduced. Most notably, another mini-boss style enemy is a slug-like creature that you must time and space a bomb within their mouth. The boss here is simple, but offers a fun use for the newfound Pegasus boots by splitting the 2 heads of the blob before using the super run to snap them apart. Completing this dungeon gives the 3rd instrument, Sea Lily's Bell, and much like the 2 previous dungeons, opens up new areas to access in the overworld. You can now combine the power bracelet with the Pegasus boots and conquer the Dream Shrine, located in Mabe Village. The name might suggest a temple or dungeon, but this is more of a one-room puzzle. Solving it gives you the ocarina, and you can immediately learn a new song outside. Using the combination of power bracelet, Pegasus boots, and Rock's Feather, most of the map is now accessible, including 3 new areas in the southeast of the map: Animal Village, Yarna Desert, and the Ancient Ruins. There is a little bit to do in all of these areas, but most notably there is a mini-boss in the Yarna Desert that drops a key allowing access to the 4th dungeon, Angler's Tunnel. This is Link Awakening's version of a water level. While there is of course combat, it is quite peaceful. Unsurprisingly, the item earned here are the flippers, which allow Link to swim in deep water without dying, which makes for a hilarious sound effect, I might add. This dungeon is of a moderate difficulty, but is overall a bit of a break from the last dungeon, which was more intense on the brain. I love the look of this place and the relaxing music, so it being of a bit simpler design was quite alright with me and is a nice pacing break. The only disappointment here for me was the boss. The anglerfish is an interesting twist since it takes place on one of the 2D planes that has the staircase sequences, but it's just so mind-numbingly basic that it feels more like a mini-boss than one that deserves a name and a big story unlock, such as the surf harp, which is given as a reward here. Obviously, the flippers allow for lots of shortcuts and connections on the overworld, including direct access to the generous fish who gives Link a new track for his ocarina that allows for fast travel to any of the activated fast travel locations in the world. The flippers open up more shortcuts between the pathways than they do new areas, since at this point in the game most of the map is already opened up. Which may seem early, but as I mentioned before, I think this game does a really great job of maximizing its surface area. The key pathway the flippers do open up is within Martha's Bay, and the 5th dungeon, Catfish's Maw. You might think that this would be another water level since this is in the middle of the lake, but it is more of a beach/cave themed instead. One of the main features of this dungeon is a rematch against the skeleton that you do a few times in a set order. Defeating the skeleton grants the grappling hook, which opens up the rest of the dungeon to be explored. This dungeon requires a lot of backtracking, not in a terribly tedious way, but it didn't stand out as one of my favorites. The boss utilizes the grappling hook in a meaningful way. This long snake-like creature has his tail causing havoc and his mouth sneaking out for hits every once in a while. You have to use the grapple hook to pull him out of the wall, and then the better you space this, the more damage you can deal. It rewards mastering the fight instead of the my turn, your turn style combat that this game's bosses run with the most. The wind marimba is the next instrument claimed. An arrow, which, unlike many other Zelda games, isn't an item gained in a dungeon to hit switches, but is instead bought in the shop. While it isn't gained in a dungeon, it is still needed to get the next dungeon key. The grapple hook opens up a few more smaller areas on the overworld, including the 3rd minigame, the River Rapids. There are 2 ways to tackle this one. You can do the river raid to earn coins and restock your supplies, or you can challenge the river race, completing this in strict times, unlocks collectibles. This is an okay minigame. It is fun the first few times while you learn the pathways, but since it is always the same, it loses its appeal pretty quick. It is also possible that I burnt myself out on it due to the fact that I did it so many times, since it is the most efficient way to farm rupees. Next up is the Face Dungeon. This is one of my favorites as well. It probably took me the second longest out of all of them and has a lot going for it. It has a beautiful and exotic aesthetic. There are some tricky enemies and a good use of puzzles. Those famous orange-blue blocks make another and their most fierce appearance yet. And there is another new puzzle aspect introduced here as well. 2 knights from chess can be picked up and thrown. You have to get them on a specific tile, but when you throw them, they bounce diagonally, so you have to position yourself correctly to make them fit. They are more introduced here and used better in a later dungeon, but it is still a nice addition. Another obstacle used here is tiles that lift up from the floor and fling themselves towards Link. These are simple to block, you just lift your shield, but the sound effect is so crisp on them that I found it very satisfying. One special detail that I really enjoyed about this dungeon is at one point you climb a staircase to what you think would be a pathway to a staircase somewhere else in the dungeon, but it actually pops you up in the overworld in a blocked off area in the river rapids. This is a beautiful little detail of world building that really goes to show how well interconnected the world is. But, as much as I love this dungeon and felt accomplished when I finally completed it, there's a couple things that bring it down. One, the item unlocked here is an even stronger power bracelet, which lets you pick up the elephant statues in the dungeon, but it is clearly reusing an earlier idea in the exact same way. This is reinforced by the fact that it doesn't lead to much more exploration in the overworld. There are other boulders in the world that you can't pick up, and this item doesn't change that. It, however, opens up 2 pathways, but those feel like they were arbitrarily gated so that this dungeon, like all the others, could have an item that affected the overworld. Secondly, the boss here is quite disappointing. Visually, it looks like it will be very special, a silhouetted face in the ground, but ultimately, you just follow it around and drop a bomb on its face, and that's about it. I think that it could have been better had the face rode up on the wall in a second phase, dropping most of the floor around it, where it is located on the wall, and you would have to throw a bomb with precision onto the only remaining tiles. With that being said, it is still a standout dungeon and shows some very creative design. The Coral Triangle is awarded here, and a couple possible pathways have opened up. One way to go is towards the graveyard. Using a code given from a book in the library and the power bracelet to push a gravestone, an optional dungeon opens up. I can't think of any other optional dungeons in a Zelda game, so this was a pleasant surprise. As the story goes, when Link's Awakening was ported to Game Boy Color, this dungeon was added as a way to show off some of the new possible colors of the system and to add some more content, but since it didn't fit into the story, it was just made optional. The color dungeon is decent, it has some fun enemies and puzzles and a boss that is enjoyable to pick on, although it is among the simplest, quickest, and most linear dungeons in the game, so while it isn't great, it is a nice bonus. The reward, since it cannot be tied to story progression, gives you the choice of the power or defense tunics. You can equip one at a time and they do exactly what they sound like, so even though this doesn't progress the story, the reward is ample. We have now arrived at what I consider to be the end game. All of the core items are unlocked, including all of the movement ones. You should be pretty powerful at this point, be it through one of the tunics and a sizable pool of hearts. The map is now completely visible and the story is closely ramping up to its final moments. The other pathway that the second power bracelet opened up is the bird statue in Mabe Village. You can push it aside and can descend to the tomb below. Here you awaken the rooster and escort it to the depths of the mountains in the north of the map. We have 2 dungeons left and they are both up here in the mountains, one on the east and one on the west. First up is the Eagle Tower. This has got to be the best dungeon in the game. It combines so much of what makes the best parts of each of the other dungeons. It utilizes puzzle elements like the orange-blue blocks, the knight chess pieces, and introduces 2 more in that verticality plays a role here. Falling in gaps no longer deals damage but drops you into the floor below. The other new puzzle element is the cannonball. You have to carry this thing around from room to room and throw it at 4 pillars spread across the 4 floors of the dungeon. The challenge comes from that Link and the ball have to take different paths. The way this meshes with the other puzzle elements is genius. The Eagle Tower is the definition of nonlinear and requires a lot of learning on the player's part. The map and the compass can only help you out so much. In fact, the map can throw you off. On it, you will see the boss room and may spend a lot of time trying to get to it. Instead, the solution is to destroy the pillars so that the 5th floor falls into the 4th floor. When this all clicks together, it is incredibly satisfying. The new item here is the Mirror Shield. It isn't used for much, it counters a couple turret-like enemies, but is not used like the equivalent item would be in other Zelda games to reflect light in certain directions. The boss of the Eagle Tower, like our angler fish of old, is fought on the 2D plane. This time, though, it is done much better. The eagle attacks at different heights and can stop to throw projectiles. It isn't a fight that is too challenging, but it can be difficult to do it without getting hit at all. Taking out the bird gives you the organ of evening calm. Traversing to the west end of the Tall Mountains takes you to the final dungeon, Turtle Rock. This dungeon starts out high intensity. To even gain access, you have to fight it through a mini-boss that it itself is more interesting and difficult than many of the dungeon bosses in the game already. Turtle Rock is the quintessential final dungeon. It is massive, sprawling, hidden in a mountain, lava coats the empty spaces instead of water, there are some brutal enemies, and in many ways it feels like a best of between many mechanics and enemies encountered on the journey thus far. At first I thought this dungeon was on the easy side because you have so much of it accessible early on, without many keyed off entrances. This feeling of relief quickly wears off though, as this dungeon never seems to end. In stark contrast to the verticality of the Eagle's Tower, this dungeon is all on one plane, which makes it a daunting task in its own special way. But much like the Eagle Tower, there is many one-way paths, so even with a map and compass, it still requires the player to learn their surroundings somewhat. The main puzzle mechanic here is these little devices that kind of look like Rob. You activate and send them out in a snaking path until they collide into something or you end it. After I found out you can turn these left and right, the dungeon started to make a whole lot more sense. The new item required here is the magic rod, which essentially acts as a ranged version of the magic powder. You can light torches from afar and destroy ice blocks. While this dungeon didn't blow my Pegasus boots off, it is effective at utilizing lots of mechanics you have learned throughout your time, and I really liked having rerun battles with a lot of the mini-bosses now that I had more equipment to fight them than when I first saw them. The magma boss that closes out the dungeon is alright, nothing special, requires you to use the magic rod that you unlocked earlier in the dungeon. The thunder drum is awarded here, and with it, all 8 instruments can be played together. To do so, you make your way to the egg of the Windfish and whip out your ocarina, as well as the instruments to join in. This serenade busts open a gap in the egg and you can enter. This isn't a dungeon, but is instead a puzzle. You have to go through the egg in the correct order to make it to the final boss. It acts much like the Lost Woods in Ocarina of Time, except it isn't in a set order. Well, it is in a set order, but this is randomly generated for each new game, and this code is hidden in the book in the town's library that you need the magnifying glass to read. This is why I said that the side quest isn't technically mandatory, but it might as well be. You could get lucky or come up with a system to test every possible combination, but you are better off to finish off the trading sequence to get the magnifying glass. Getting the magnifying glass also lets you get a couple collectibles and lets you get the boomerang item. Anyway, back to the egg. After inputting the correct code, you can make it to the final boss, who is looming deep within the egg. This shadowy figure is a multi-phase battle that requires most of your items and your endurance. It is without a doubt the best boss fight in the game, both in its intensity and its multi-layered requirements and its difficulty. Clearing this boss is the end of the story and activates the final cutscene and credits. As I said in my non-spoiler thoughts, the story is fine, but it didn't strike much of an emotional chord with me. Perhaps it has much a deeper meaning, but to me it was serviceable and nothing more. After completing the story, your save cannot be accessed anymore, so I reloaded to my previous save to explore the rest of the content in the game. After completing the main story, the other things to do include getting all 50 seashells. These are hidden all over the map. Some require digging or bombing in certain spots, some require talking or playing a song for a certain NPC, some can be earned through minigames, in dungeons, or through the chamber dungeons. Heart pieces are a bit simpler. These are hidden but are often at least visible, whereas the seashells are off screen. There are 32 heart pieces to find and collect. Scooping up the hearts and the seashells can add a few hours of your playtime, but it is mostly busy work. The hearts obviously give you more HP, and the seashells give you a couple unique features, including the ranged blade attack for Link. The main source of additional content in Link's Awakening is the chamber dungeons, which we'll talk about next. To close out this part, I would say that 3 of the dungeons are amazing, and the rest are decent to good. Exploration is wonderful. I know I touched on it briefly, as each new item gives you some new paths, but it should not be understated how well the world is put together. It's just something that can't really be explained as easily as a dungeon, and has to be experienced. All in all, my time spent on the main game was nothing but incredibly enjoyable. Even the lesser dungeons are still great to experience the first time around. Let's talk about the chamber dungeons. This is a new mode added to the Switch version. The way it works is this. The player takes dungeon rooms from dungeons they have beaten, or from chamber stones, which are another collectible in the game, and pops them onto a grid to create dungeons of their own. This is both a puzzle and a challenge mode. Now, I love things like this. I've always enjoyed simulator games or games that let you get creative and do some building of your own. I am a massive fan of Binding of Isaac, which is a roguelike that uses random generation to make Zelda-style dungeons that you can play endlessly. It's one of my favorite games of all time, somewhere in my top 20, so needless to say, I was incredibly excited for this feature. I ended up not liking it very much at all, and finishing all the levels was more tedious than it was exciting. I see this mode as an experiment instead of a fully fleshed out feature, and I wonder how long this has been brewing in Nintendo's oven before they decided to stick it into Link's Awakening. Or perhaps this mode is here as a test to see if people like it and want more of it. Because more than anything, this mode feels like an incredibly basic and cheap version of what Mario Maker is for the 2D Mario games. The chamber dungeons have baseline depth. My guess is this simplicity is that there isn't too much thought required to make this work and it could be shipped functional. The early levels simply require you to make a path between the start and finish. The later levels require you to fill in a certain shape or positions for stairs and chests. The puzzle aspect of putting these together is very minimal. There is one that you have to use exclusively staircase rooms. This one took me a little bit of thinking to solve, but for the most part you can just brute force your way through these solutions. But worse than putting these together is playing through them. To see why, let's talk about what makes a great dungeon in the first place. Your list may differ from mine, and even mine could sway based on many factors, but I've tried to make just a general list. I split these into 3 categories. Number 1, primary reasons. These make for the best and most rewarding moments of getting through a dungeon. Number 2, secondary reasons. These are all those things that add to making a dungeon feeling complete and fun details, but on their own can't make a great dungeon. And then bonus reasons. These can have an effect, but are not game changing. Starting with bonus reasons, I'll include the general aesthetic of the dungeon. This encompasses the visual appeal and the music. The face dungeon has that beautiful exotic aesthetic with bright purples and bronze tones that make it visually striking. The Angler's Tunnel, between its soft blue water and calming music, make for a nice environment to stop around in. Another bonus reason can be the dungeon's pacing in a story or progression sense. If you have been stuck out in the overworld for a couple hours trying to find out where to go next, feeling a bit lost, perhaps happening upon the dungeon, is a satisfying feeling since you know that you can complete this for guaranteed progression. Finally getting to enter the Eagle's Tower after seeing it for so long is rewarding to finally see what is inside this bizarre structure that extends out of the player's point of view. Secondary reasons can be down to mechanical aspects, such as fun enemy types to fight or an intriguing boss fight. Getting to fight against Mario enemies or Kirby is fun and memorable. And while the colored dungeon and its boss are quite simple, it's sure fun to beat up on those enemies and that boss. Another reason can be as simple as game feel. A dungeon, regardless of difficulty, if the movement around it is interesting, like the verticality in the Eagle Tower, or the grapple hook and the catfish's maw that come to mind, are just fun to navigate. As for primary reasons, there are 2 that stand out to me. 1, newly acquired items midway through a dungeon are always a great feeling. Instantly, they recontextualize the dungeon so far, and your mind starts to think of how you can use that item in itself and how you can combine it with other items. Within Link's Awakening, I would say that the Mirror Shield and the second Power Bracelet are a touch lackluster, but every other item is a treasure to unlock. Along with helping solve the dungeon at hand, these items turn into something great for exploration outside the dungeon, so the excitement starts building as soon as you get it. And the final and most satisfying moment to me is the click moment. That moment when it all comes together in your head and you can piece together the vital path, or you solve the puzzle aspect of that dungeon. The moment when you blast through the 4th pillar in the Eagle Tower and the 5th floor sinks into the rest of the dungeon is a fantastic moment and is easily my most standout moment in the entire game. When you finally figure out how to maneuver the obstacles that have been holding you back, these moments are incredibly rewarding, often more rewarding than beating the boss of the dungeon at the end. With that laid out, it is probably already becoming apparent how the chamber dungeons can't reach these heights. There are only a few unlockable rooms that aren't copy-pasted rooms from other dungeons in the game, meaning you have experienced them all before. The exceptions to this are you can unlock every boss room to be a regular room, so you could set up a boss rush if you want, with the exception of the final boss, that is. One feature I do like is that you can scan your Legend of Zelda amiibo to unlock up to 5 extra rooms. I have a few of the Smash Bros. Ones, Link, Toon Link, Ganondorf, Zelda, and Sheik. I was hoping these would have a room dedicated to each character, but it seems that there are just 5 base rooms to be unlocked, and any 5 Legend of Zelda amiibo will unlock them. Either way, it is a nice addition and is appreciated. Looking back at the list of reasons for what makes a dungeon great, let's break it down. You could create one with a nice visual appeal, but since it is the same music and same look as the dungeons you have seen before, there is nothing new to find here. Some of the rematches are fun to do, but there are no new enemies here. As for the new items, obviously you can't get any inside the dungeon, although I didn't unlock the boomerang or ranged sword attack until after completing everything else, so this was a place to test those out. Ultimately, there isn't any puzzle mechanics or enemies designed around them, so it didn't add all that much variety. But most importantly, that rewarding feeling of figuring out a dungeon, solving its puzzle, utilizing all you have learned and achieving that click moment just isn't possible when you yourself are the one creating the dungeon. You know where everything is and how to get to it. You always have the map and compass because there is no reason to hide them in the level. You always have to unlock every chest because it automatically sets the boss key in the final chest. They do add some challenge aspect onto some of these by taking away your sword for a level or making you beat it in a time frame, but since these can't be done until later when my character was fully stacked out, none of these proved to be a challenge for me. It was a slog to get through these, and I ended up just trying to find a way to cheese the system via staircases to get these efficiently instead of creatively, since there was no incentive to be creative. This mode being a disappointment comes in 2 forms. 1, because I was anticipating it due to the concept, and 2, because there really isn't all that much content in the game, so this would have been a good place to add a few enjoyable hours, but it just wasn't. I hope Nintendo takes this idea and adds a whole lot of depth to it so we get something like a Zelda Dungeon Maker alongside Mario Maker. I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility. This is clearly an attempt at it, and between Hyrule Warriors and Cadence of Hyrule, spin-offs for the series are certainly not off the table. If this mode could have had more varied room layouts instead of just rectangles, if you could choose the look of each room, choose what and who is inside, if you could set which items were allowed and which ones weren't, or which ones unlock during the dungeon to give that click moment, if you added multiplayer like 4 swords, if you could upload your levels online and let your friends and people around the world play and rate them, I think we'd have a really special game in our hands. There are an incredible amount of Zelda fans out there, and I'm sure they would love to come up with some genius designs and make an infinitive amount of levels across the Zelda styles. But as it stands, the Chamber Dungeon feature feels like a half-baked dungeon maker that was tacked onto this game because it wasn't good enough on its own, and that way Nintendo could advertise this game with a shiny new feature and justify that $80 Canadian price point before tax. I loved most of my time with Link's Awakening and can happily say I got out of it what I wanted, with the exception of the Chamber Dungeons. It feels like classic Zelda, but is a lot more cute, and its story and setting are goofy and lighthearted. Nintendo created some remakes for Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, and I'm curious what is next other than Breath of the Wild 2. Will it be a fully realized dungeon builder? Perhaps a remake of A Link to the Past? I would personally be down with a remake for Minish Cap as well. All in all, it's interesting to go back to a game like this after seeing how ambitious Nintendo has gotten with the mainline Zelda games by looking at Breath of the Wild. What a journey it has been. As for this journey, the dream is almost over. That's about all I have to say on the game, so I just want to say thank you so much for tuning in. I'm still new to this whole scripted episode thing, so I hope this was enjoyable. Be sure to let me know your thoughts in the comments or directly to me on Twitter @DylanMuss. If you like what we do here, you can slide over to our Patreon where we have timed and full-on exclusive content available at the $1 amount. Alternatively, you can Pegasus boot your way over to the Apple Podcasts and give us a review, or find GeekVerse on Facebook or Twitter. You can also make your way over to Stitcher and use the code GeekVerse, GeekVerse, to get Stitcher Premium for 1 month free to try it out. It helps us out, helps you out, helps Stitcher out. So overall, it's a good thing to do. If you are looking for more gaming content, boy, do we got you covered. Starting November 2nd, you can find us supporting Extra Life with our yearly 24-hour stream. Be sure to mark it down on your calendar. As for this year, we've had reviews for Marvel's Ultimate Alliance 3, Outward, Into the Breach, Wargroove, Celeste, Bad North, and we have many more coming up in the form of Luigi's Mansion 3, The Outer Worlds, Death Stranding, Pokemon Sword and Shield, that Star Wars game, and I'm currently working on an episode for Overland as well. So thanks again for listening, and I will see you on down the trail.